Okay, so this is pretty cool. In my hands, I'm holding the right hemisphere of a real human brain. Now, most of what you're looking at, see all this folded stuff? That's called the cerebrum. This thing down here is the cerebellum. Now, the cerebrum is in charge of a lot of different things, but what I want to focus on is this part right here. This is called your frontal lobe or frontal cortex. Now, this, believe it or not, this whole area right there doesn't fully develop until you're 25 years old. And that's where your personality and a lot of your rational decision making are located, or, well, lack thereof. Okay, so here's your cool human fact for the day. Your heart is covered in a connective tissue layer called the pericardium. Now, I'm pulling this to the side, and believe it or not, I can even pull this heart out, and we can see this empty pericardial sac. Now, this would normally be filled with fluid to help reduce all the friction the heart generates as it beats. So this may seem a little strange, but believe it or not, this is not your stomach. Your stomach is all the way up here, behind the liver. So when you're saying that your stomach hurts, you're really saying your intestines hurt. That's what these are. These are your small intestines, not your stomach. So what I want to focus on today is this area of the central nervous system called the cerebellum. Now, the cerebellum's job, besides looking really cool, is to smooth your muscle movement. So let's say I wanted to wiggle my fingers. That decision would begin up in this area called the motor cortex. Now, what would happen is these two structures would communicate with one another to make that movement nice and smooth. Without the cerebellum, I could still move my fingers, but it would be far more disjointed and sloppy. The heart is probably my favorite organ, and there's so many different reasons as to why that's true. But something I want to show you that never ceases to amaze me is just how cool it looks on the inside. Now, if you look and see this white flap thing up top, that's called the mitral valve, and it separates the left atrium from the left ventricle. And what's attached to it are these things called the chordae tendineae. Those are your literal heartstrings. The heart is just the workhorse of the body. This thing beats, on average, 2.5 to 3 billion times over your lifetime. Today I want to talk about what happens when your kidney creates a kidney stone. Now, the kidney's job is to filter urea, a waste product, out of your blood, mix it with water to now be urine, and send it out of your body. But occasionally it forms this little mineral deposit. But little's probably not the right word, because if we look at it compared to the ureter, you can see the problem already. It doesn't fit all that well. And it's this size difference that creates all the problems you've heard of, including immense pain. Today I want to talk about a muscle that most everyone has heard of, and that's the biceps brachii muscle. Now, the reason why it's called biceps, that means two heads. We have a split. You see, we have two different heads that form one muscle called the biceps brachii. Today I want to talk about appendicitis. Believe it or not, this tiny little thing right here is your appendix. If it gets to be about the size of your index finger, you run the risk of it rupturing. And if that happens, bacteria will make its way into your abdominal cavity and you could go septic. Today I want to talk about the lung. Now, this is a right lung, and you can see two different colors here, more of a pink and then this discoloration here. The discoloration isn't exactly normal, but overall these are very healthy looking lungs. Now, as I pull it out, you see what almost looks like a cut has been made, but that's not a cut. That's showing the different lobes of the lung. And in fact, I can pull the entire thing out and we can see that your lungs are absolutely enormous. Today I want to talk about how your brain has two helmets. You have a hard helmet and a soft helmet. The hard helmet is exactly what you think it is, and it's the skull. And if we look on the inside, you can see where it almost looks like rivers have carved into stone. This is from the meningeal arteries pulsating, and the bone forms around it. Now, the soft helmet is this thing. This is called the dura mater, or mater, and it's a meninge that surrounds your brain. So you could think of it as a soft tissue helmet. Today, I want to talk about the occipital lobe of the brain. So the occipital lobe is located in the back of your head. So this would be the front, this is the back. Now this is pretty cool. You can see these blood vessels on the superficial part of the brain, and then this is the cerebellum down here. But the occipital lobe's job is to process visual impulses. So my fingers and the brain and the phone you're holding in your hand are all in the back of your head right now. Today I want to talk about your thyroid gland. So the thyroid sits just below your Adam's apple, or thyroid cartilage, and just above your trachea, or your windpipe. So this purple butterfly-looking gland helps regulate your metabolism as well as lower how much calcium is inside of your bloodstream.
So what I have here is the skin off one of my cadaver's backs. Now, what you can see are like freckles and moles and age spots, but what I want to look at is this cross-section of the skin, because what I'm touching here is called the epidermis, but most of what you're seeing is the dermis. Now, the epidermis is what sheds and the dermis isn't. So let's say I drew on this skin with like a pen. Well, the reason why that would disappear is because the epidermis flakes. But if I did a tattoo gun, the ink would push down into the dermis and would be more permanent. A question that I get a lot is, what is the difference between muscle tissue and tendons? You see, tendons emerge from muscles. Muscles are normally wrapped in a bunch of connective tissue layers. So as the muscle cells end, the connective tissue layers continue on. And what happens is they then blend with a bone and they cross a joint. So when the proteins of the muscle contract, it ends up pulling on the tendon, which causes a movement to occur at the joint. I want to talk about the spleen. So the spleen is going to be on the side of the liver and your stomach on your left side. So this doesn't really do it justice. It's much bigger than this. So watch as I kind of pull this thing out. It's about the size of your hand. Like you could fit it in your palm. Now, the spleen is going to have multiple functions. It helps break down red blood cells. It helps store blood in case you lose too much. It's essentially a giant lymph node. But yeah, that's your spleen. It's just going to be hanging out on your left side right by your stomach. I want to give you a good view of what your internal organs are going to look like. So let's go ahead and move the pec major muscle, the pec minor muscle out of the way, and then I'm going to grab the rib cage or chest plate, and as I move it, we can see the internal organs, such as your liver and diaphragm, your heart and lungs and intestines. But this is what you look like on the inside. Let's talk about hiccups. You see, hiccups happen because of this muscle, the diaphragm, getting stuck in a neurological feedback loop. You see, if it sends a sensory neuron to the spinal cord, a motor neuron gets sent right back and tells it to contract. Now, the lungs are going to be attached to it. So as it contracts, it pulls on the lungs, and that quick influx of air causes you to hiccup.
All right, so what you're looking at, believe it or not, is a real human skeleton. And I just want you to take a quick look at this thing, because as you do, it's going to look quite a bit different than what you're used to in your health class, right? That's because bones have individual character to them. And what I want to show you is something called spongy bone. And if you look really closely, you can see how on the inside of the bone it looks like a sponge, and that's where you're going to find a lot of red bone marrow. But bone has character to it. It's not just this stale type of rock sitting inside of your body. It is alive and very, very cool.
All right, so let's go ahead and talk about why every pregnant woman has to pee a lot. This is part of the uterus, and you can also see an ovary hanging out behind it, but the thing I want to focus on is the fact that this uterus is right above the bladder. So I want you to go ahead and picture this thing getting really big with a fetus and all of that weight pushing on this bladder, and that is why every pregnant woman has to pee a ton.
This is a really cool piece of tissue called the retinaculum, and what it's going to do is it's going to strap down the tendons of the muscles of the forearm as they enter into the hand. You see, without this wristband-like tissue, every time you'd extend your wrist and digits, the tendons would kind of just flip up. So luckily we have this retinaculum that's going to bind those tendons down. So what I have here is a cross-section of a real human thigh. Now, why I like these cross sections is because it allows you to see a lot of anatomy at once, such as the femur, the quadriceps, the hamstrings, and the adductors. We can see blood vessels and all these white connective tissue lines that separate each muscle from one another. Cross sections are very useful when studying anatomy. A question I get asked a lot in the lab is, why would you leave the elbow skin on? And that's because, well, it's not just elbow skin. This was a fluid-filled pouch called a bursa. You see that empty pocket? Inside of there would have been a lubricating fluid that would help the skin glide over the ulna or the olecranon process underneath.
Let's talk about a muscle that most people have heard of called the pectoralis major muscle. Now, if you're doing the bench press, you're primarily targeting this muscle and trying to get it to be big, like you want big pecs. But what a lot of people don't know is that it has a little brother. There is another pec muscle called pectoralis minor just underneath it. Kind of crazy that you have two different pec muscles. I used to think the Achilles tendon was only that big, but in reality, it is this big. In fact, it goes up nearly half or more the length of your entire calf. This is the strongest tendon in the human body. What I have here is skin from a lower leg or around the calf region. Now, I can open this up, and this is pretty cool because what you immediately see is going to be adipose tissue or fatty tissue. Now, the job of fat and adipose tissue is to store energy, and it does that so you don't have to constantly be eating. What I have here is a real human vertebra or backbone. Now, this comes from the thoracic region, or where your ribs would be located, but I want to talk about one of the most important functions of vertebrae, and that's to protect your spinal cord. If we pretend my finger is your spinal cord, you can see that it has this bony protection that goes around it. So not only do bones support weight, just as this vertebra does, but it also acts as a protector for neurological tissue. So cool. Let's talk about this thing right here called an intervertebral disc. You see, this is a cushion that separates these two vertebrae or backbones. And so you can kind of picture as you're moving, these two bones would want to slam into one another, but this is preventing that. Now, with this particular cadaver, we have something interesting as we move in the more cranial direction, and we notice they start to thin out and almost outright disappear. And that's because this cadaver had degenerated discs. Now, that happens due to a lot of reasons, but still, as you look at it, you can tell that they are very different than even these ones up here in the cervical region. So this is going to be interesting. I'm holding part of a scalp on one of my cadavers, and if we look closely, we can see hair, we can see a mole, some age spots, but what I want to focus on is this. You see, that's a scar. This cadaver had a head injury at some point. So if I flip it on the inside, if we look at it, you don't see any evidence of the scar, which is kind of cool. But here's the craziest part. If I start to hold this up to the light, you can see the light start to shine through the scar tissue. What you're looking at is the knee. We see the patella, the quadriceps tendon, the patellar ligament, but what's really cool, watch this, is wild. I've cut this so I can reflect it back. Now that pink stuff, that happens occasionally as the embalming process interacts with the soft tissue, but you can see the posterior aspect of the patella as well as this smooth surface of the femur that the patella would glide on as you are flexing and extending your knee. But this is what your knee looks like on the inside. So what you're looking at here is the back of the thigh, and these are the hamstrings. You see, the hamstrings are really three muscles. We have biceps femoris, semitendinosus, and semimembranosus. But what's kind of cool is if I push them in like this, something emerges from behind them, and this is the sciatic nerve. You see, the sciatic nerve is really two nerves bundled together, but what happens is it normally splits down here in the knee. But the sciatic nerve is hiding behind your hamstrings. What you're looking at here is the abdominal region of a female cadaver, and so you can see that we made an incision through her core muscles. We did that so that we could reflect the muscles back and reveal the deeper structures of her abdomen. This yellow piece of tissue you're looking at is called the greater omentum. It has a few different jobs, but one of my favorite jobs of it is, let's say you get an abdominal wound, this will attempt to plug it and seal it from the inside, preventing further blood loss. Really, really cool. Now, if you're interested, we filmed this dissection process and put it on our YouTube channel, and the reason we did that is because we had another question, and that is, does she have a uterus? If I were to pull this omentum back and see the intestines and then pull the intestines out, you would see whether or not she has a uterus. So if you're interested, go ahead, head on over to our YouTube channel and you'll see the whole process. I want to talk about how anatomy can be an imperfect science sometimes. You see, this is the muscle called latissimus dorsi, and there's a genetic variability that this particular cadaver has. You see, this is the scapula or shoulder blade, and if you notice, latissimus dorsi is going on top of it. I'm kind of putting my finger around the inferior angle of the scapula. That doesn't happen in everybody. Not everyone has this muscle go on top of the scapula. So the question is why? What kind of advantage could that do? And if we move the scapula, you can see that that muscle would almost act like a strap, keeping it or helping to keep it attached to your axial skeleton. So I want to talk about the different types of intestines you have. You have small intestine, which is all about nutrient absorption, and then you also have large intestine, which is a little hard to see, but that's what this thing is here. You see the large intestine is going to border your small intestine. I can kind of show you a bit of it here. And the large intestine or colon is where you store feces. So your small intestines will absorb nutrients, and then whatever waste you have gets deposited into your large intestine, and it can take days for it to make its way around until it finally is going to leave. You see, this is called your sigmoid colon, and it turns into the rectum. So the difference is the small intestine is about nutrient absorption, but your large intestine or colon is about feces storing and water removal. I want to show you the longest muscle in the human body. You see, this is called the Sartorius muscle. Now, its length obviously is going to be different depending on how tall you are, but this muscle comes from all the way up here in the hip, and it travels down and goes past your knee. Let's take another look at my real human skeleton to talk about a broken wrist. You see, the wrist is more of a region as opposed to one singular structure. Inside of your wrist, you have 8 little carpal bones, and you also have the radius and ulna. If you break your wrist, typically it's going to be right around here on the radius, but it could be this bone, the scaphoid. In fact, it could be any number of these bones breaking in any number of ways. I want to show you how you can tell the difference between a vein and an artery. You see, what you're looking at here is a vein, and I can tell that for a couple different reasons. And first off, it's kind of blue in color, and that's because the color of the blood vessel is blue, not the blood inside of it. Some of you have probably heard that deoxygenated blood is blue. That's not true. The color comes from the blood vessel. But another way I can tell is it's very thin and flimsy. You see, veins are very flat because what happens is they take blood back to the heart, and they do that when skeletal muscle like this contracts. It squeezes the vein and pushes the blood back towards the heart. Arteries, on the other hand, are going to be a little bit different. You see, these are going to be more muscular, thick, and pink in color, and as I squeeze it, what you'll notice is it always bounces back. That's because as the heart beats, the arteries expand due to the pressure, and then as the heart rests, they collapse back. What you're looking at here is a lower leg, but what I want to focus on is this thing. This is the tibia, or your shin bone, and you'll notice we've cut a little window into it. That's because I wanted to show you that your tibia, just like all other long bones, is hollow on the inside, right? That's called your medullary cavity. Now, what you'd normally find in there would be yellow bone marrow, which is another type of fat storage. What you're looking at here is the right hemisphere of a real human brain. But what I want to focus on is this gray and white stuff. You see, the gray is called gray matter, and the white is white matter. The gray matter is where cells are synapsing and communicating with one another, while the white matter is where their signals being sent to. So that means you, as in your consciousness, is only located in the gray stuff. What you're looking at here is a real human heart. But what I want to focus on is this thing. This is part of the aorta. It's called the ascending aorta. This is the largest blood vessel in the body, and it tends to be about the size of a garden hose. It's absolutely enormous. Today I want to show you one of my favorite skeletal muscles called the psoas major, and the reason why it's one of my favorites is because of how deep it is. So watch this. I got to remove the chest plate and the core muscles, and then I see this fat pad called the greater omentum. I pull that over, and then I see the small intestines. I move those things out of the way, and we see this yellow tissue here called the peritoneum. I have to then slide that, and there it is. That is one of my favorite muscles called the psoas major. And you see that white line on it? That's called the psoas minor. They are just crazy deep inside of the body. Okay, so I want to give you some cool facts about the human brain. You see, the human brain weighs around 3-ish pounds. It varies a little bit. Males can have a somewhat larger brain on average, but that's simply because men tend to be larger on average. It has nothing to do with intelligence or anything like that. You see, both males and females have around 86 billion neurons in this 3-pound organ. Absolutely crazy. But my favorite fact is that this 3-pound organ here takes 20% of your daily calories. That's absolutely incredible. So what you're looking at here is a real human heart, but what I want to focus on are these squiggly lines. You see, these things are part of a network called the coronary arteries. Their job is to deliver nutrient, oxygen-rich blood to the heart muscle itself. You see, the heart needs blood and nutrients in order to work. But if these things get clogged, typically to dietary issues, we call that a heart attack. You see, a heart attack is when the heart muscle doesn't get blood and oxygen to supply it to make it work. Let's talk about how your skin varies in thickness depending on where you're looking. This is skin off the back. This is skin around your calves. And believe it or not, this is skin from an eyelid.
What you're looking at here is a real human skull. Now, as I get closer to it, you're going to immediately notice that it looks much different than any plastic skull you've probably seen before in your life. But what I want to focus on is this thing. This is called the foramen magnum. It literally means big hole, and this is where the end of the brainstem, the medulla oblongata, and the spinal cord exit the cranium, and then they go down the back. But there's just a gigantic hole at the base of your occipital bone. So I want to show you just how long your digestive system is. So what you're looking at there is the stomach. So we're going to follow from the stomach through your small intestines. You can see just how much it's twisting and turning. All of this is the small intestine until we get to the end. You see this darker, somewhat larger tube? That's going to be your colon. So when you average it out, from the stomach all the way down to your colon, it's somewhere around 25 to 30 feet. I want to show you what cancer looks like in the human body. This discoloration here is cancer that had spread and metastasized to the liver. See, anywhere you see these discolorations is going to be cancer. You can see another one right there. But what's really crazy is if I lift it up, you can even see it on the underside of the liver. Those are all cancerous nodules. I honestly can't tell you how many times I've been asked to discuss period cramps, so here you go. See this thing? This is part of your uterus. During your period, it's going to start contracting. And as it contracts, it's going to slough off an inner membrane that's going to go out the vaginal canal. That, in essence, is a period cramp, but there's a ton more interesting detail. And if you're interested, head on over to our YouTube where I discuss it a whole lot more. What you're looking at here is a real human mandible, or what most people would call the jaw. Now, if we look closely, we can see where all the lower teeth would be. You can even see kind of like that spongy bone that I've mentioned in previous videos. But what's really cool is you see this hole here, and there's another one on the other side. Those are supposed to be there. Those are called the mental foramini. And those are where blood vessels and nerves come out of. But I don't know, I've always thought the mandible is a really cool, interesting looking bone.
What you're looking at here is part of your upper digestive tract, and we can see part of the tongue, your Adam's apple or thyroid cartilage, the thyroid gland, your trachea, and if I scoot that to the side, we can see your esophagus, or your food tube, as it turns into your stomach. Your stomach is then going to turn into your duodenum, or part of your small intestine. But let's say you just ate some food, so you swallowed it and it fell down into the stomach. The stomach is then going to start contracting and bathing it in stomach acid or hydrochloric acid, and it acts like a cement mixer. You can literally picture your stomach doing these contractions and moving the substance around until it turns into a paste called chyme. But let's say you secrete too much stomach acid, or let's say you're pregnant and the stomach gets scooted up super flat. The stomach acid can then be pushed up your esophagus and start to burn the esophageal lining where you don't have the protection that the stomach has. We call that heartburn or acid reflux. What you're looking at here is a real human skull with the top removed,
so we can see inside of what's called the cranial vault or neurocranium. Now, obviously what would go inside of there would be the brain, or two hemispheres. But that is the location of your brain.
So many of you probably heard someone say, I tore my rotator cuff. Well, the thing is, the rotator cuff is really 4 muscles. The first one is up here, called supraspinatus. The next one is right here, and that's called infraspinatus. The super slender one is teres minor, and then if we flip it onto the back side, we can even see another one called subscapularis. So the problem is, when you say I tore my rotator cuff, well, which one?